With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah Daf Lamed Vav. We left off on top of the Amid. We're going to learn more about the invalidations, the qualifications that is needed for an esrog to be kosher, as we had in the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Dalid Amid Beis. We're going to learn about the punctured esrog. We're going to learn about a esrog that's missing, this punctured, and missing, this punctured, and nothing missing. There's going to be an amazing comparison, zushtel, between esrog and simane treifa. We're going to learn about many other physical blemishes that invalidate the esrog that are not mentioned in the Mishnah. We're going to be questioning whether an esrog is considered a fruit prior to it being fully ripened. And we're speaking specifically about a stage that's called boiser. Now, the word boiser is really used when we are speaking about a underdeveloped grape, or a grape in a very early stage of its development. A esrog that's called boiser a grape that's called boiser is a grape that has the size of a white bean. That equivalent in the esrog is going to be a big topic in a machlokes of Tanoim. We're going to have on Daf Lamed Vav Amid Beis, the Gemara is going to tell us that Rebbe Chanina, listen to this, he would make a bracha and he would bite into his esrog, he would dip it into a sauce, he would bite into his esrog, and then he would use his esrog for the mitzvah. And as the Gemara is going to make clear, that the importance for an esrog to be wholesome, ulakachtem, it should be a complete lekuach tam, that's only by Yom HaRishon. And from the second day onwards, outside the Beis HaMikdash, where there the mitzvah of the dalad minim is only midrabanan, there is no necessity for the esrog to be wholesome. Even a deficient esrog will be okay. However, when it comes to the inyan of hidur, that we want for the esrog to be beautiful, and especially as we mentioned, Rashi in the beginning of the Perek, it's not only connected to the hadar, but generally when we do mitzvahs, right, Zekei Livi and Veyu, that is an obligation for us to have during the entirety of the 7 days of Sukkot. And on Daf Lamed Vav Amid Beis, we're going to learn the Mishnah. Firstly, that will quote the machlokes as to what may and may not be used to make the bundle of the lulav, hadas, and arava, and then the Gemara is going to bring the machlokes as to what may and may not be used for schach. We mentioned this once in the earlier part of the Masechta. Aside of the criteria that's needed for the schach to be kosher, it has to be something that grew from the ground, it has to now be disconnected from the ground, it cannot be susceptible to becoming tamei. Shitas Rabbi Yehuda is that it must be dafker from the dalad minim plants, and no other plants, even if it meets the 3 criteria that we had earlier, will not be valid for schach. We're going to have a gavaldik rule regarding a kal v'chomer, and the words are that kol din sha'ata don tchilosei lahachmir. But if the soifai lahakal einoi din, and chevra much more. Again, let us start on the Daf Vav Amid Aleph. We left off all the way on top of the Amid. The Mishnah the Gemara is referring back to the Mishnah that if nizdak, if the esrog is split, and when we learned the Mishnah, we explained we're speaking about it being split towards its core. It's going through the rind, the thick rind that goes through the majority of the rind, even if it's not deficient physically, it's considered chaser, it's considered deficient. And then the Mishnah spoke about nikev if the esrog was punctured. Now, when we read the Mishnah, let's quickly go back. And the Mishnah, there were 2 girsa'os in the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah Daf Lamed Daled Amid Beis. So our girsa was nikav v'chaser kolshu, that if it's punctured and it's deficient, that is when it's possible. That is the girsa, and based on that, let's continue reading now our Gemara. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam shar kol nidvarim. In other words, if it's punctured and nothing is missing, from our Mishnah it came out that the esrog will be okay. Says the Gemara, not so quick. Tanei Ula bar chaninam, or the other girsa is Ula bar chinanam, that if nikaf nekav mefulash, that if the esrog was punctured through and through, even if that puncture hole is b'mashahu, is the minimum size possible, l'mashal, you took a needle and you put it all the way through the esrog. Other Rishonim hold that if it went into the pulp and into the sack in which you have the pits, that's also called mefulash. In other words, either to the core, or if it's not going through the core, but if it goes from side to side, then b'mashahu Rashi clearly writes, even if nothing is missing, the fact that it went through and through invalidates the esrog. Or another case where even though nothing is missing, the puncture hole will invalidate the esrog, v'she'ena mefulesh, but b'ke'iser. If it's such a large hole that it has the size of the coin known as an isser, and again, nothing is missing. So a person used an instrument, right, to burrow through the esrog and to put all of the rind to this side and to that side without removing anything, even though it's all there. But if it's a groiser hole in the size of an isser, then the esrog will also be invalidated, even though nothing is missing. But listen to this truth shell. This is amazing. Rav inquired, no, by in Chulin we learned about the 18 types of treifa, which are certain physical defects in an animal. And even if the animal was properly slaughtered, the animal is called treifa, may not be consumed. If we're going to have the simanim of treifa in an esrog, will we say that the esrog is invalidated? That is what Rava asked, and it's amazing that we are making this comparison, but the Gemara right away is trying to clarify what is Rava's boya, when really, l'cha'ura, the Mishnah mentioned, if not all, but we'll see, almost all of the invalidations, taka, as we have by Treifa, we have them here in our Mishnah by Esrog. So, frek the Gemara, what exactly was Rava inquiring about? If he was inquiring about niklaf, we have over there in Chulin, if the animal's skin was completely removed, the animal is treif. Well, here also, if it's niklaf, if the skin was removed, well, we learned it in our Mishnah. Truth be told, as Rashi learned, we had noch on top of the Amid, that if all of the skin is removed of the esrog, then it's taka okay. But if it's patchy, it's spotted, it's speckled, then it's not okay. But at least the Mishnah addressed the invalidation of peeled. If the question of Rava was regarding nizdak, regarding it being split, right? Well, Tanini, we learned it in our Mishnah, as we just began today's share with. If it goes through the majority of the thickness of the esrog, it's invalid. If nikav, if it's punctured, again, Tanini, we learned. Whether nikav vechaser, nikav ve'ener chaser, even if nikav ve'ener chaser, if it's mefulas, if it has the size of an iser, it's invalid. So, what's the shaila of Rava? Says the Gemara, Kikami Bayalei. The question was, we learned in Chulin that Ula says in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, that if there is a lung, that the fleshy part in the lung became so liquidy that you are able to pour it out the way you pour water out of a flask. So we learned over there in Chulin that the animal is not tereifa, the animal remains kosher. What's pshat? That the lungs have a 2-layered membrane that surround it, as long as the double layer is not punctured. That's the whole glat, not glat. We don't want it to have any blemish. Then, if the membrane, which is really a double membrane, if it's intact, then the animal is kosher. And another detail, ve'amar Rava over there in Chulin, v'hu, that's only correct, the kaima simponia, that if the simponia is the name that we have for the bronchial tubes, they have to remain intact. If the animal's symponias are intact, in other words, the ear passage is still intact, as long as the outer membrane is intact and the symponia is intact, this animal's lung will heal, right? However, Rava added the whole lekhaim is symponia, but if the symponias already became ruined and they became watery, then the animal is treif. So that's the rule we have concerning an animal. And that is what Rava inquired. What will be the din of an esrog? Now, what will be the equivalent of a lungs that can pour like water over here by an esrog? So it's very important. So the outer membrane, not only the outer skin, the rind is intact. But the pulp, and there is some pulp inside an esrog, the pulp became completely watery. Question is, will the esrog remain kosher? Now, what will be the equivalence to the inner bronchial tubes? That's going to be the sac that holds the seeds and the seeds. So if that is intact, that means the innermost part is intact. The rind is intact. The pulp became watery. That is what Rava inquired, what will be the din by the esrog? Could we say, like we say by treifa, that the animal is not treifa, maybe such an esrog will also be kosher, it won't be invalid. Do we say, and why yeah, why not? Dilma Hassan hu delishalad be'avira, that over there by the lungs, sins as long as the outer membranes become intact. So air, oxygen won't get inside this watered down, this watery flesh, and therefore hadar barye, it can regenerate, which is why the animal is not going to be treifa. Amazing. In other words, it is the contact of air that is to the detriment of the healing of the animal. But over here, by the esrog, even if the outer rind is intact, but the air will somehow make its way through this rind, and it will go and have contact with the pulp that now became watery, the shalad be'avira, and therefore, sarucha masrachas, it's going to completely get rotten, get ruined. In other words, it will not regenerate, or perhaps, no, even by the esrog, there's a possibility that the fruit, had it been left on the tree, with time will regenerate, and therefore even prior to that, the esrog should still be considered kosher. So now we clarified, and what's the answer? So Tashema, it says in a Braisa, if you have an esrog that's tafuach means it decayed, or if the esrog is saruach, if it rotted, we'll have to clarify what's the difference between decayed and rotted in just a moment. Or if it was kavish, if it was pickled. You know, someone took an esrog and he soaked it, I don't know, in vinegar, or in other liquids that are used for pickling purposes, or shaluk, you cooked it a lot, extensive cooking, or kushi, the esrog, the darkened esrog, as we'll see in a moment, more about the esrog kushi, or if it's white, lovin, or if it's menumah, if it's speckled, if it's spotted. So says the Braisa, all of the above, pasul. Furthermore, esrog kekadad, if the esrog is perfectly round like a ball, pasul. The Yesh Oimrim, and another opinion holds, Af Hatiyoim, that also a twin esrog is invalid. What's a twin esrog? So the oikitz is one. There's one stem. But then as the fruit comes out, it becomes like a twin, like a Siamese twin. It becomes like you see there's like two esrogim, all connected into one. And other people hold that that's also a problem. Here we go with the picture. Aha, that's a great picture of a, it looks to me like a kushi tohim. Weiter, esrog, haboiser, we spoke this out in the introduction. Now guys, when grapes develop, there are different phases of the grapes development. When it's in the size of a white bean, it's called boiser. So let's word it this way, it's a grape that it is in its early stages of development. That equivalent stage in the esrog is what the Braisa is talking about. An esrog that's in its early state of development, according to many Rishonim, not exactly the size of the white bean, but the equivalence of that stage in the esrog. Machloikas Tanoim, Rabbi Akiva Poisel, V'chachamim Machshirim, and we're going to have a lot soon about the underlying Machloikas Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. Another din in the Braisa, Gidloi Bitfus. If you had the esrog as it's growing on the tree, you put it inside some sort of form. This is very common. And as the esrog is growing, the form is forcing it to assume a different shape. And if if it looks like a complete different creature, we're speaking about a complete different fruit. You know, today I remember there were certain watermelons that were square, so you can store them better. So you can they're not going to roll. And a bunch of the same concept, they put the watermelon when it's little inside a box, into a square box, and then when it grew, you forced a different form on it. Says the Braisa Pasul. Okay, that's the end of the Braisa. What does that have to do with Rav's boya? What about if an esrog noildu by esrog semani treifa? So here clarifies the Gemara, and now Ktanim Mihas, the Braisa began speaking about tafuach and another issue called saruach, decayed versus and rotted. And how are they different? My lav l'chura, tafuach means mibachutz. Tafuach, decayed, means that the rind decayed. That's the outer part. That will be equivalent like the membranes in the lung. Saruach would mean, no, the outer membrane is whole. The rind is fine. the inside, the pulp is rotted. And on that, what does it say in the Braisa? The Braisa says that it's possible. The Gemara's presumption is that even though we're speaking about the pulp being soruach, but the seeds and the sack in which the seeds are laying, that is okay. Yet, that's mamish the case of the lung. That's like the case of the lung. And yet the Braisa says possible. So this should answer the boya of Rava. Says the Gemara loy. I will tell you that maybe, when does the Braisa say that it's invalid? Idi, both the word tafuach, the case of decayed, and the case of rotten are both referring to the rind. And that's why it's taka puzzle, because that will be, let's go back to Samani Treifa, that will be equivalent to the membranes of the lung. If they are punctured, you got yourself a problem. Even if there's only a sircha, you have yourself a shaila. The difference between decayed and rotted is had the tafach, afal gav de loy sarach, eva had the sarach, afal gav de loy tafach. Decayed means that the rind itself became wet, and let's say it became bloated. There is nothing extraneous connected to the rind. It itself is just very bloated. That's called decayed. Rotted means is that there is a mold that developed in it. There is a fungus in it. There's some external something that is that got connected to the rind. That's called saruach. However, we don't know from this Braisa what were to happen if the rind is intact, if only the pulp is now watery, or only if the pulp is rotten, if only the pulp is decayed. Maybe taka, like by the lung, as long as the sack and the seeds are where they should be, the esrig remains kosher, so this boya is not resolved. Weiter. Amar Mar, the master, the Braisa said, esrig kushi is possible. And by the way, we had the same thing in the Mishnah. Correct? We had in the Mishnah, Daf Lamed Dalid Amid Beis. We mentioned about the esrig, that's kushi, that it is possible. Only concerning Yorei Kakarti did we have the Machloikas Tanoim. Okay, how did we teach esrig akushi? We spoke about an esrig that is very dark, it has a very dark pigment. Problem is, V'hatanya kushi kasher. Well, there's a stira in Tanoim, and we would rather not make it into a Machloikas Tanoim. So the Gemara clarifies that like this: if it actually came from Ethiopia and the esroigim over there have this dark pigment, it's 100% kosher, because it is the way it naturally is. But doim elakushi, if the esrog doesn't come from Ethiopia, it grew in other countries, where normally over there the esroigim are yellow or greenish, yellowish, but from another location it looks like the esrog that came from Ethiopia, that's already an anomaly, Gavaldik. And therefore it is invalid. Interesting. In other words, if it has a natural color of that region, it's okay. Hold on. If that will be the case, so Amar Abaya, so when we have in our Mishnah didn't write Doimel Kushi Pasal. Our Mishnah wrote Kushi is Pasal. So not to challenge the resolution that we gave above, says Abaya, our Mishnah also only meant Doimel Kushi Tanan. But our Mishnah also will hold that if it actually comes from Ethiopia and those esregim there are all with a dark pigment, then that's going to be okay, because that's the natural color of that region. Rava says, no, absolutely not. Rava says, loikash. Our Mishnah didn't mean doimel kushi. Our Mishnah means esrek hakushi. There's a big difference between whether you live in Bavel, whether you live in Eretz Yisrael. Hold on. Our Braisa, the Braisa that says doimel kushi is pasul, but kushi is okay. That's referring to us here in Bavel. We are more familiar with a dark pigmented esrog. It's not that unusual. Yeah, if it didn't grow in Kush and it looks like a kushi, that's already a abnormality. That's already an anomaly. That's not good. But if it actually came from kushi, it's the natural color, it's 100% okay. But people that lived in Eretz Yisrael, they never saw an esrog from kushi. Here again we have the concept that whenever there is an invalidation based on beauty, beauty is subjective. Right? It's not deficient, there's no balmum, there's no crack. Beauty, that's, so if you are if it's not the usual color, but you're familiar with it, you have seen it before, and a taka came from Kush, that's what the Gemara is saying, that's the Braisa, that's okay. But if a person lives in Eretz Yisrael and they never saw that, we have whoever's watching over here, none of these esrogim over here are Kushim. Just different, no, but I think we have some of the pictures that are online over here are other blemish types of esrogim. Okay, right.
But importantly, Rabbi, the fruit doesn't have to come, or one of the four species does not have to come from Eretz Israel.
Very clear that they don't have to come from Eretz Yisrael. Very good, Baruch. And actually, we have a tradition, it's written in the Midrash, that when Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu to take the esrog, and when God taught Moshe, and Moshe Rabbeinu taught the people, it was a very hands-on teaching. The oral Torah. So God showed him, so God actually brought to Moshe an esrog from Calabria of Italy. And in many communities, including the Chabad community, we make an effort, if we could, to buy esrogim that actually came from there. Very interesting. And not from Eretz Yisrael. Okay, weiter. The Braisa spoke about this esrog that's in its early stage of development, known as boiser, in the words of the Mishnah. Esrog ha-boiser. Rabbi Akiva, not good. Chachamim, okay. So says Rabbah, that I want you to know that Rabbi Akiva over here and Rab Shimon elsewhere, as we'll learn in a moment, Amru davar echad, they are of the same opinion. Rabbi Akiva is what we just mentioned, and the way Rabbah understands the rationale behind Rabbi Akiva is that an esrog is not considered a fruit before it's completely ripened. Verstehst Chavra, that's not a hidur issue. That's not a beauty issue. It's not called a fruit. The Torah says pri. From when is something a fruit? Rabbi Akiva holds only when it's fully ripened, that's called a fruit. Boiser is in an earlier stage of development, it's not a fruit. And Rab Shimon, where do I see that Rab Shimon considers an esrog at the stage of boiser not to be halachically considered a fruit? That's based on, even though it says here Detanya, so the Mesoides Hashas amends it to a Tanan because it's a Mishnah in Maisris. There we are specifically speaking about esrogim, that Rab Shimon pointed eso esrogim bekoitanon. In other words, if someone harvested esrogim while they are in this very early stage of development known as boiser, Rab Shimon exempts them, Rashi here tells us, from removing maisris. Oh, now the Tana before Rab Shimon in that Mishnah says that since even when it is only in this early stage of development, they are edible, so it's considered food and considered a fruit, and therefore you are obligated to tithe them. And Rab Shimon holds that even though it's edible is not the criteria for which to say, it's edible, it's a fruit. No, it has to be mature. And boiser is still too early for it to be considered a fruit. So understands Rabbah Bishitas Rab Shimon. So they're taka saying the same thing. They are both subscribing to the opinion that the boiser stage in the esrog is not halachically called fruit. It's not called a pri. Says the Gemara, Amalei Abaya, says the student to his teacher, to Rabbah, no, Dilmaloi. I don't accept this comparison. I can argue at kan loy kama Rabbi Akiva hache over here by the esrog in the boiser stage of development. I will tell you, perhaps Rabbi Akiva holds it's a fruit. It's a fruit. The reason why he says it's not valid for the mitzvah is because of hidur, like we mentioned. And hidur is generally, there are exceptions, a lesser of a problem. It's not called beautiful. It's not developed. It's not about the size. It's about the stage and development. The be'inan hadar veleka. But perhaps, Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah of Maisris, do you tithe? Do you not tithe? It has nothing to do whether the produce, whether the fruit, or midrabanan, whether the vegetable is beautiful. I don't care about beauty. I just want it to be considered food. Maybe Rabbi Akiva will hold, like the Rabbanan, which is the Tana before Rab Shimon, that as long as it is edible, and an esrog from the stage of boiser is considered edible, And for me, even a ripe esrog is bitter. You have to know how to prepare it. But whatever, it's called edible for the esrog, and you'll have to tithe it. That's on one hand. And furthermore, says Abaye, Inami, I'll go in the other direction as well. You can't compare one to the other. At Kanli Kamer Rab Shimon Hassan. Over there, who says that the reason why Rab Shimon holds that a esrog that was harvested at this earlier stage doesn't have to be tithed is because Rab Shimon holds it's not a fruit. Maybe it has nothing to do with whether it's food or not. There is another very fundamental question that will determine whether something needs to be tithed or not. And what is that? When it says aser to aser, you shall surely tithe as kol tfuas arecha. Right, the entire crop, your entire crop. Now listen to the words zarecha. What does zarecha mean? The crop of your planting. That word doesn't belong here. You should tithe your crop. Why does the Torah say zarecha? Understands Rab Shimon. Listen to this limud. Kederech shebenei adam moitzim lizriyam. Produce. Listen, for the dinim of maisres has to be sufficiently developed that if you were to plant them as they are, they're sufficiently developed to germinate seed, to create further. And Rashi points out a few lines before the bottom of the Amud that the Mishnah there is also speaking about apples, the aris roigim, and there are apples, and it turns out, says Rashi, that the only fruit from all of the fruits that God creates, that at its stage of boiser, it's not strong enough for the seeds to further germinate is the esrog. It's an apple in the size of boiser. Even though it's very early in its development, the seeds have the potency to plant them, and they're gonna produce another tree. The esrog doesn't. In other words, it's edible. It's not about it being a fruit. When it comes to maisres, it's not enough for something to be a food. Something has to be a food enough that if you were to plant it, it will germinate. Aval, back inside the Gemara, over here meaning maybe Rab Shimon, as far as is an esrog in the size of boiser, a kosher esrog or not, maybe he'll hold like the Tana before him. It's considered food. Listen, the fact that the Chachamim hold that has to be tithed is the Charai that the Tana over there in Maisres holds it's food. All I need is for it to be food. So here it's going to be considered a fruit. It's a pri. Maybe avalachi kerabanan svirale. In other words, his disconnect is two sides. And whenever you have this comment, a Amoida makes a statement that he finds it to be so powerful. So daflam advavam adveis v'sulay midi. V'sulay midi means there is nothing else I have what to say. He applauded himself. Okay, weiter. And weiter, we're going back to the Braisa. The Braisa is spoken now about an esrog that was put in a form. In other words, the esrog is on the tree. The form was placed on the tree. And gidloi betfus. And what happened? Va'asoi kmin beri acheres. The esrog b'chlal doesn't look like an esrog. You can make any form you want, then the Braisa says it's possible. Omar Rava says, Rava, lo yishanu el kamin beri acheres. Yeah, the problem is that it doesn't look at all like an esrog. Aval kibri yasoi, but if you had a form, and the form enhanced, you put it in a form, you wanted it to be, there's so many different ways of defining the gartel in the esrog, what's the most beautiful form of the esrog. So people build forms, so the esrog should come out in the most beautiful idur. So instead of paying $200, you'll pay $770. Oh, that's kosher. So frek the Gemara, why do I need Rava to tell me that? The Braisa said that the issue is not that you put it in a form. The issue is that the form made it look like a beria acheres. Frek the Gemara pshit, mean beria acheres. Tanya, that should be the right emendation. And if it looks like an esrog, then it's good. So the Gemara says, no, that we need to have the statement of Rava tzricha, because you can put it in a form, and what did you do? You mamish enhanced, or you exaggerated the characteristics of the esrog. You made it dape. You made it plank. You made the ridges and the grooves be exaggerated. And that's taka unique about an esrog. That's why it's very important when we spoke about the chazazes, the boils. It's not the normal, the mountains and the hills and the valleys that are going up and down on the esrog. What you did is that you exaggerated it. That's okay. That's okay. That's what the Rava means. I don't know if that's the right picture. That's definitely not the... Well, I know that it says here planks, but I see that as I don't know, the esrog, all of the ups and downs and all of the grooves. It's pashut, all of the grooves and all of the ridges. They are very exaggerated. That's okay. Why? Because it looks like a cartoon-like esrog, but it doesn't look like a beri acheres. Okay. And now we finish with the Braisa. Now we are introducing statements of Amoraim, and it's pashut mind-blowing, because after learning all this, right, one thing became clear as we spoke out, that hidur is subjective, but many things are not hadur, not muhudir, not beautiful. And then you have, if it's deficient is much worse. Here says the Brais, says the Amoraim, Itmer. If you have an esrog, shenekevu'u achbarim, it was punctured by mice. A mouse or a group of mishpacha of mice, they found your esrog and they nibbled on it. Now here it's mamish. We're speaking about there are holes in it. They ate it. It's deficient. Says Rav, ein ze hader. Ooh, it's not called beautiful. Now, one second. L'choira, what Rav is saying is that not only is it deficient, which makes it invalid, it's also not considered beautiful. Question is, why do I need the Rav's addition? If it's already deficient on the intrinsic deficiency of chaser, then I don't need this additional not hadar. But the bottom line is Rav says it's not beautiful. And that itself is going to be challenged. How can Rav say that? Rabbi Chanina, listen to his minig, matbil ba, Rabbi Chanina would dip his esrog in a sauce, because an esrog is very bitter. So the sauce, so to say, sweetened it up. And dipping it into the sauce doesn't just mean that he dipped it into the sauce. It means he would make a bracha and he would take a juicy bite out of it, and then he did the bracha with it. Some people today, they smell the esrog before they do the bracha, which they shouldn't, because it's designated for a mitzvah. We should not have anar from it. But here you have him, he took a bite out of the esrog, and then v'nothing, but he fulfilled his obligation. Now if you're going to tell me that if achbarim nibbled on the esrog, it's not called hidur, it's not called beautiful, so him taking a bite out of it, that's a beautiful esrog? So that's the question on Rav. So the Gemara says, I don't understand, why are you challenging Rav from Rabbi Chanina? Forget about Rav, forget about hidur. Like we mentioned, a deficiency in itself is a problem. If he took a bite out of the esrog, that makes the esrog into a chaser. And now the Gemara is going to introduce something amazing. And this really goes back to the beginning of Lulav Hagazal. When we spoke out that that midoi raisa, if you're not inside the Beis HaMikdash, if you're not lifnei Hashem, then the actual mitzvah of the arbas haminim is only on the first day. Second day onwards is only a rabbinic. Now, do the high standards of the kashrus of the esrog continue throughout the second day onwards? No. And that's the Gemara's chiddush over here. That the issue of ulakachtem, what's ulakachtem? Lekichatama, that we want the esrog to be wholesome, that's only by Yom HaRishon. A deficient esrog on the second day onwards is kosher. Wow. Here we lost the camera, we lost the chaval, mamash chaval. However, the concept of hidur, I have to make sure to take off my mute when it comes back on. The concept of hidur is for all the 7 days. Wow. So that which is normally considered subjective, that which is normally considered subjective, where there's more lee room. For me this is considered beautiful, amazing. If it's not hadar, then it's not good for none of the 7 days. Hidur has to be for all the 7 days. It has to be wholesome only on the first day. Look inside the Gemara. Because I'll explain to you that can be Yom Tov Rishon. Our Mishnah that invalidates a deficient esrog is only speaking about the first day. When did Rab Chanina take a bite out of his esrog and then use it? That is from Yom Tov Sheni, means the second day onwards. But if Rav is adding that not only if it's deficient, not only in esrog that's deficient is problematic if mice bit on it, but it's not beautiful. The issue of hidur needs to be for all the 7 days. El Rav Kashem. Gavaldik. So Amalach Rav, don't challenge me from Rabbi Chanina. You know why? Shani achbarim de meisei. That when a mice nibbles off the esrog, then it looks disgusting, and it's lacking in hidur. But if a human being takes a bite out of the esrog, it's not disgusting. Herst, the kapis tomarim adds that if that's the case, that if mice nibbled out of the esrog, and then you cut off that area, so you don't see the little seindalach, you don't see the little punctures of mice teeth, then it's going to be good. Because we're saying that from the second day on, I don't care if it's deficient. I just don't want for someone to look at the fruit and see that mice nibbled on it.
What about a hole going through? Is that the same thing?
What about if a hole went through? For sure it's not a problem according to what we're learning right now. It was what we began today's share. It's a big chiddush this, that the issue, anytime it's deficient, that's only a problem for the first day. Ikeda Amri, other people say, Adarabba, that when there was a esrog, that mice nibbled on it, Amarav zehadar. No, it's good, it's still okay. And the proof was, to Rabbi Chanina, matbul bava nafik, but Rabbi Chanina, he would take a bite out of his esrog and fulfill the obligation. And therefore, is araya that if someone bit something out of the esrog, it doesn't lose its beauty. Ula Rabbi Chanina kashya masnisim. How can Rabbi Chanina do that? It's deficient. So here the Gemara answered, no, our Mishnah is only speaking about the Yom Tov Rishon. And Yom Tov Rishon is only, their chaser is not good. Ulokachtem lekichatama. And Rabbi Chanina would only take a bite out of the esrog, the Yom Tov Sheni. Gavaldik. Just repeating again the story of the Rebbe, like why would he do that? I mean, taking a bite out of an esrog, maybe that's the way he expressed his love for the mitzvahs. He's eating up the mitzvahs, he's internalizing the mitzvahs. Okay, esrog katan. The Mishnah spoke about the machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. What is the minimum size that an esrog has to be? Rabbi Meir says the size of an egg or of a walnut. Rabbi Yehuda holds at least the size of an egg. V'chulei. Amar from Bar Papa k'machlokes kan kach machlokes ba'avonim mikur zalois. Just like we had today on Amud Aleph. We lost the connection again. We had this comparison between an esrog and treifa. Now we are making a comparison, and it could be that this comparison is only for memory. Only for memory, meaning that it doesn't necessarily mean that this connection is a related connection. But at least for a memory aid, mamish, like by esrog, we have a similar machlokes regarding the rule of the mikurzoloi stones. What's the mikurzoloi stones? In the times of Chazal, we did not have toilet paper. And when people went to relieve themselves, what they used to clean their body is that they would have certain type of sharp-sided stones that they used to scrape off or to clean off any physical remains which is on the body after one relieved oneself. Now the issue, the dinim of arvanim mikurzalois is not at all, God forbid, regarding hoitzah. One may never violate a biblical on Shabbos, but we're speaking specifically that if someone has an outhouse in an area where there's an eruv, there is no issue of carrying. But we also learned that stones are muktzah. That's a derabanan. It's a very strong derabanan, but it's a isur derabanan. And when it comes to human dignity, Chazal sometimes were very lax. They opened up their derabanans in order to provide human dignity. And taka, the din is that if a person is going to relieve oneself, there is a certain amount of these stones of the toilet paper that you are allowed to take with you. And it's not an issue of mutzah. And there also the Tanya b'Shabbos, number one, when it comes to the number of stones, Gimel avanim mikur zalois, 3, which was what was needed, muter lahachnis lebeis hakisei, kavod habriyos. And here, and not only do the Tanoim give you the number, but the kama shiuran, there is a size, and if it's larger or smaller, let's go smaller, then it won't be that effective, and therefore you may not take it. So Rabbi Meir says that what's the size? Ke'egois. Rabbi Yehuda says what's the size? Kebeitza. So it's a great mnemonic aid. So we have 2 times throughout Shas, Machlekes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda regarding the size. One concerning here by Esrik, and one over there concerning avonim mikur zolis. Weiter. Ubegadol, what's the maximum size of an esrog? Says the Mishnah. Again, here we had a machlekes between Rabbi Yehuda, remember, and Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yehuda limited. He says that it has to be. You have to be able to hold 2 esrogim in one hand. If it's bigger than that, then it's not good. Remember, Rabbi Yosi. We lost it again. And Rabbi Yosi said, Azvos, that if you can even have an esrog that you need 2 hands to hold it. Tanya Amar Rabbi Yosi, Ma'aseh Rabbi Akiva, Shebalo Beis HaKnesses ve'esrogoi. Listen to this, and his esrog was over his shoulders. That's how big it was. And in other words, clearly Rabbi Akiva subscribed to the shita of Rabbi Yosi. There isn't a maximum size. However, Amaloi Rabbi Yehuda, that Misham Raya, you're bringing me a proof. He's telling Rabbi Yosi from what happened to Rabbi Akiva. Well, when he walked into the Beis HaMedrash with that humongous esrig, Afeim Amruloi, everyone told him, Ein Zeh. Interesting, it's an issue of Hidur. Ein Zeh. We actually did have earlier on this whole question whether Rabbi Yehuda holds that you have to have Hadar by the esrig. But that's only Shitas Rabbi Yehuda. We lost it again. Okay, says the Mishnah. We, mamash, God willing, will fix this today. Zok the Mishnah. Just waiting a second for the Zoom connection. Oy gewalt, chaval, mamash chaval. Boom.
You're back.
I know.
Progress.
Well, guys, I'm sorry this is happening. Believe neither we'll fix this today. We're up to the Mishnah. We waited over here. Says the Mishnah, when you bind the lulav bundle is again the lulav and the hadassim and the aravois. What material are you allowed to use? Says the Tanach, says Rabbi Yehuda, only from the type of those 3, from one of the 3, from all 3, but you can only use plants, right, from its kind. Rabbi Meir says, no, you don't have to use the rope, the binding material can be afilu bechut b'meshicha. Many ways of interpreting it. We're going to go with, it can even be a linen thread. We're dafka speaking linen because it's a plant, but it's not from the 4 minim. And furthermore, to Amar Rab Meir, Ma'aseh ba'anshe Yerushalayim, shehoyu oigden es lulaveim b'gimoyne yoy shel zahav. They used golden fibers. B'chlal, not even a plant. This is already a mineral. This is already a metal. So Amrulai. So to take away Rabbi Meir's proof, well, the Anshe Yerushalayim really held that you have to bind it with its kind. Really, b'minoy hoyu oigden oisay milamata. What connected the lulav with the hadassim and the aravos was b'minam. Right, today we use a leaf of the lulav branch, but then to beautify it over the binding, it's like a decor, a ribbon. They put some golden fibers, but it wasn't bound with the gold. Now there's a whole issue, which is when you grab onto the lulav, does that create a chatzitza? But that's not an issue because could be they didn't hold it over the golden binding. No, it's wherever today, Dafka Men and Chabad is that we use 3 knots that bind them together. The other 2 is just keeping the lulav stronger together. Kafus, Kishitas Rabbi Yehuda, Kapois Kafus. And we Dafka put the 3 knots so close to each other that they all fit into one tefach. So when you hold it, you don't even see it. But maybe over there, that this gold was above it, was below it. Okay. Says the Gemara, and this is Gavaldik. Amarov, let's see how far we can get. It's good, we're early. That when Rabbi Yehuda holds that it has to be b'minoi, guys, we have, lulav, hadas, and esrik. The hadas is clear. The alrav is clear. The lulav. So you have the branch of the lulav, and we taka make the rings from the branch, from the leaves of the lulav. What are you allowed to use from the tree itself? Is the tree, now what could you use technically, practically from the tree? Sieve, we keep on learning about sieve, is called ivy. Ivy is some sort of natural rope-like substance that grows around the trunk of the tree. Or can you use, if you know how to do it, if you can take a piece of the bark. Now it's not beautiful, doesn't look great, it doesn't enhance the appearance. It's dark, it doesn't feel that great, but it's part of the tree. Even, says Rava, bi'ikara dedikla, you can use the bark of the tree. In other words, Rava's point is that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, that you limit the material to do the binding, b'minam doesn't have to mean dafka with the lulav part. Any part of the tree is considered b'minai. Now, v'amar Rava, another statement of Rava explaining our Mishnah, my time of Rabbi Yehuda, unlike Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda's lishitasa, since Rabbi Yehuda holds, as we learned above, Machlekes Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the one that says lulav tzarech eged, that binding it is not some sort of, we learned even according to the Chachamim, it's mitzvah, it enhances, right? It's like a voluntary enhancement. No, it's beyond that. It's not optional. If it's not optional, if it's essential, then the materials that you are using for the binding has a greater importance. And if you will use anything other than lulav, hadas, and esrik, because of its importance, that's called Bal Toisif. Because then you're going to end up not with 4, including the esrik, you're going to end up with a 5th type. Gewaldig. And Rab Meir, who says you can use b'mechud b'meshicha, Rab Meir held, we lost it, that Anshe Yerushalayim, they used golden fibers because lulach ein tzarech eged, since ein tzarech eged, it's only called an enhancement, it takes away the chashivus of it. And we're not going to count it as a chamisha mine. We're not going to be over on Bal Toisev. Okay, now we're going to go back to the first statement of Rava, that Rava says that b'minoi doesn't only mean the branch of the palm day tree. B'minoi is any part of the tree. Afilu b'siv, afilu b'ikara de dikla. Now, question is, you can challenge that, and Rava is going to anticipate that. V'amar Rava, b'mino amino la de siv v'ikara de dikla mina de lolavahu. And it doesn't have to be dafke. It doesn't have to be dafke the branches, the tanya. And this is a lengthy brisa, and the conclusion of the proof is going to be on Daf Lamed Zayin, and God willing, we'll get to. It says in Parshas Emoir, says the Tana, says the Braisa, Sukah is teishvu. Chavre, this is very important. What is allowed to be used for schach? Now we learned earlier in the Masechta the 3 criteria. Remember? Something that grew from the ground. Number 2, it's now not connected to the ground. And it wasn't made into a keli. Or in the words of the Mishnah, it's not susceptible to becoming tummy. Are there any other restrictions? Yes, machlekes tanoim. Sukah is teishvu. Sukah shall call davar. Sukah means chach. Divrei Rebbe Meir says that as long as it meets these 3 criteria, anything that grows from the ground means not only from the dalad minim, anything, any plant. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Rabbi Yehuda says ein sukah neyeges elot bedalad minim shebelulav. Wow. You must use plants that are from these 4 species. How does he know it from? He has a kal v'chomer. Says Rabbi Yehuda din noisen. What's this kal v'chomer? Uma lulav she'ein noig ba'leilis kebayomim. Right? It says bayoim horishin. And bayoim here doesn't mean 24-hour day. It means the daytime of the day. The mitzvah of lulav is only during the daytime of the day. Yet, nevertheless, it's restricted. It has the stringency of einoi noig ela ba'arbas minim. That's clear. Only those 4 types. So a sukkah that is already more stringent than the lulav, because you have to dwell in it 24/7, not only during the daytime. Sukah shonei hagas ba'leilis kibayamim. So if a sukkah has the greater stringency, you have to be there for the entire time. So certainly it has at least the stringency of the lulav, which is it has to be only from those 4 types. Okay. So 1 second, how did you refute that Kal V'Chaimer? So Amrulai, in defense of Rav Meir, it wasn't just Rav Meir. Everyone told Rabbi Yehuda, that's not a Kal V'Chaimer. Why is it not a Kal V'Chaimer? This is a very important klal in Kal V'Chaimer, is that everyone can be done ma'atzmai, because kol din she'atu dan tchilas ila hachman. If you try to litigate a stringency, which is the whole Kal V'Chaimer, something that's more stringent should have more stringencies. It should have, you can only use the 4 minim. Anything that initially actually adds the stringency, but it ultimately would lead to a leniency, but it leads to a leniency that refutes the Kal V'Chaimer. If you're going to tell me that the schach must only be from the arbas minim, it's not a stringency, it's a stringency that leads to a leniency. Why? Practically, not everyone can get hold of those 4 types of plants. And what happens if you are limited? You can only use chach from the arbas minim, and if you're not going to have it, what are you going to do? What, you're going to starve? You're going to end up being outside the sukkah. You're an oinus. There's nothing you can do. So limiting the schach to that is going to ultimately have people b'chlal not be in a sukkah. On top of Lamed Zayin, loy matzah arbas minim, and if you're limiting it, so then hu yehi yoshev ubatul. So if you're trying to be machmed, taking just the arba minim is not easy. By the way, many communities in Europe only had one for the whole community. It's not that easy to get the 4 minim then. But at least you only need the limited amount of it. 1 lulav, 1 esrik, like we're learning today, 2 adasim, and at least 3 adasim and 2 aravas. But to have the whole schach, that's a whole different category. 1 second, but don't forget, guys, all of this is Rava bringing a raya that the 4 minim, beminoi, can even mean the tree itself. Where do we know that from? Hold on, we're in the middle of it. And in other words, like Rabbi Meir, sukkah should call this chach can be made out of anything. We lost it again. And v'chein be'ezra, guys, be'ezra here means Nehemiah, which is part of Ezra, which we consider in the bigger, there's Ezra and Nehemiah, that is always, the whole thing is called Ezra. So go out and bring ali zayis, branches, right, with olive leaves. Va'ali eitz, shemen and pine needles. Va'ali hadas, we had this above. Here the hadas refers to the hadas shoite. Va'ali tamarim, palm leaves. Va'ali eitz avos, leaves of, now eitz avos is also hadasim. That was the word we had before in the Masechta. So the hadas is hadas shoite, and eitz avos is dafke, kosher, what we call kosher hadasim. Now the Torah speaks about ali eitz shemen. The Torah speaks about Ali Zayas. Guys, the pasuk is clearly mentioning species that are not from the Daled Minim. And it says over there, La Asois, Sukahs, Kakosov. So you see beferish in scripture that what did they use for the sukkahs? Other plants. So hold on, that l'chayda should refute Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda savar, yeah, you have a pasuk. But when he was asking to bring those materials, who said he was asking to bring those materials for the schach? The ones that are mentioned over there that are not from the Daled Minim, hanel defanis. But ale hadas, the ale tamarim, the ale eitz avos, which are also mentioned over there in Nehemiah and Ezra, that's takal schach. Okay, chavra atkan the braisa. Now, what does Rava prove from the Braisa? Now, we did learn on Daf Yud Dalet, Chevra, we had a Mishnah above that says, Mesachachin b'nesarim divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Remember that? You can use beams. That whole takana, right, of making it like a tikra, the whole sugya we had on Daf Yud Dalet. And let me ask you a question. Now, put everything together. If Rabbi Yehuda here is saying, and he's saying that you have to use the Daled minim. You have to use the Daled minim. And Rabbi Yehuda is the one that holds that that you can only make that you can use nesarim. Let me ask you, from which of the Daled minim are you going to have a beam? If it's only the leaves, right, or only the lulav, that's not a beam. A beam you can only create from the trunk of the tree. This is beautiful. This takaraya. Alma, we see that the trunk of the tree is part of the Daled minim. Is a raya that the sieve, that the ivy that grows around the trunk of the palm date tree, and or v'ikara the dikla, and the trunk is mina de lolavahu. Gavaldik. And indeed, says the Gemara, Shma mina. We'll stop over here, God willing, to be continued.